Recording in progress.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Streicker Center. This is the third in our Women on the Move author series. I am Marjorie Schuster, coordinator of our literary events. Special thanks, as always, to the Samuel I. Newhouse Foundation for their support of this series. It is really a great pleasure today to welcome today's guest, Joyce Maynard, author of 18 books, numerous books of fiction, crime, memoirs, and children's books. Her latest book, Count the Ways, is a not-to-be-missed family saga of life and struggles. I could not put this book down. In conversation with Joyce today is journalist Jordana Horn, editor of the Call Your Mother podcast on Kveller. As always, please write your questions in the chat feature of Zoom, and Joyce will be happy to answer as many as we can get to at the end. Right now, it is my great pleasure to welcome Joyce and Jordana. Hello, ladies. I'm going to sign off.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. Before, I know that the number one question in the chat will not be about the book. It will be about your background, which is not just a Zoom background, but is in fact an actual background. Could you please share where in the world you are and why it seems to be the most amazing place in the universe?
With great pleasure, Jordana. And first of all, I just want to thank everybody who's joined us this morning. I'm at Lake Atitlan, Guatemala, where I have a home where I come to write. I'm actually working on a new book right now. And I also host writing retreats and memoir workshops for women. It's been something I've been doing for over 20 years now. This town, this culture, it's a Mayan indigenous village, is very dear to me. And I love to host Americans who don't know about this place, North Americans, because I'm in America too. So that's where I'm speaking to you from. And I wish you could be here. I wish you could be sitting in my garden and smelling this. I have a gardenia, but you'll just have to imagine it.
Oh, Joyce, I also wish that I were there, and I feel certain that every participant in this Zoom feels the same way. But I wanted to tell you, my real first comment was that I wanted to say that Count the Ways is extraordinary. It is a real emotional kick in the pants. I say that with approval because I think it's a masterful look at the nature of love and the nature of family. And I wanted to start by asking you what your main motivation was in writing it. And I know that now you're working on a sequel to the book. So obviously it's something that resonates very deeply with you as well.
Well, I think I tell this to my writing students. I think all of our best work comes out of our obsessions. And one of mine for sure is family. The search for family, my own family was complicated, I will say, because I'm speaking to a Streicker Center audience, that I was the product of a mixed marriage of a very Christian background father and a very Jewish, Russian immigrant Jewish mother. And our household was complicated and problematic. And there was probably nothing that mattered more to me as a young woman, more even than career, although I was right in the forefront of second wave feminism, than to be part of, to make a happy family. And I share that trait with Eleanor, the central character of that novel. I used to say the only way I'll be part of a happy family is to give birth to one. And like Eleanor, I fell in love, young, married, moved to a farm in New Hampshire. There were many similarities, well, I bet we'll get to this, between my life and hers, and many differences. This is a work of fiction. And we broke apart. Slowly, the marriage, as so often happens for people who have loved each other and have the best intentions, we lost sight of each other. So the novel is an exploration of a young love affair, young parenthood, making a family, and a divorce. But I didn't want it to end there. I wanted to explore the aftermath of a divorce, and which sadly is one of my themes. My own marriage ended when I was 35, which is to say 32 years ago. What is unique to this book, because it's not the first time that I've looked at these questions, is that I'm looking at them from the age of 67, almost 68. And the kinds of anger and bitterness and resentment that so understandably fuel our emotions when we're younger fade away. So this is really a book about letting go of those things and about forgiveness.
You preempted one of my questions, which was that one of the novel's many heartbreaks is this fundamental deviation between our expectations and our realities. And so that's whether we're talking about a child's genius potential that is sadly unrealized, or the romantic flames of true love. And I really do feel that all of these are the kind of truths that only a writer who has lived a full life can really appreciate. And so I wanted to know if you would be comfortable talking a little bit about how your writing has evolved from your entry onto the writing scene as this young teenage prodigy to now, both in terms of your subjects and your outlook on them.
Well, first of all, I'll say, Jordana, and to everybody in the audience, I'll talk about anything. I'm not one to hold my cards close to the chest. I'm rather infamous in some quarters for this. I've been called, a shameless oversharer. I don't really know what that means. I don't know that shame is a virtue we want to exalt. Yes, for sure. I started writing very young, and you would have had to have, and started publishing very young. You would have had to have known my mother to understand how this could be. Both my sister and I were different in many ways, but we share the understanding of what it was to grow up in that household with a woman just sort of exploding with talent and gift and creative energy and education. My mother was the possessor of a PhD from Radcliffe. It was not Harvard yet. And like so many wives and mothers of the 1950s, she could not get a job. My voice still cracks when I say this. My mother sold encyclopedias door to door and tutored Latin for $1 an hour. And like so many of our mothers, poured all that energy and ambition and hope into us, her daughters. This is a very Jewish concept, And I felt from a very young age, I don't remember ever being so young that I didn't feel a responsibility to lay at her feet the kind of acknowledgement that she deserved. So I was she was typing up my manuscripts when I was 7, 8. My first publication was not in the New York Times. It was in Humpty Dumpty magazine. Some of you may be old enough to remember it. Then Junior Scholastic, then 17. And more than for myself, I did it for my mother. I published my sort of famous first, entry into the publishing scene when I was 18. And I was pictured on the cover of the New York Times magazine with a story whose irony I did not get at the time. I was so young. An 18-year-old looks back on life. And that launched my career and many other things, not all of them good. Inspired me to leave college, which was a very poor decision. I dropped out of Yale when I was 18. And I have never stopped. But I have certainly, I think in the early days, I was writing for my mother. Now, and I was delivering the stories that I felt she would want. Now I tell the stories that are the truth. And that's a little different and closer to the bone. And I write, I feel a huge responsibility to readers, men and women. I never think of myself as just a writer for women, but to talk about the things that people don't talk about often. Because I grew up in a household like that, where there were some of the most important things that were affecting our lives were not talked about. In my case, the fact that my father was an alcoholic. So this novel is not about any one particular sort of difficult topic, but in the course of the novel, like the course of life, this woman, this family, experienced things that happen in all our lives. One of her children, and this is a piece of fiction, I'm not giving away anything here when I say this, it's established pretty early on in the novel. One of the children, unlike any of my children, makes the decision to transition to the gender that he felt he always was. And he makes this decision in the year 2000 when it was a far more shocking thing. Count the Ways isn't about transgender children, those issues. It's about the life of a family, but these kinds of things happen. And I wanted to talk about those things. I've been hugely informed and educated, I should say, by the hundreds and hundreds of women whose writing I have assisted over the years. As I said, I teach memoir. It's my labor of love once a year. And I listen to their stories, and I don't ever steal their stories. They're private, but they inform my own.
And in this book, it's described as a family saga, but the mother, Eleanor, and her life experience is its nucleus. And I think that many of us, perhaps who are mothers, maybe we can find that role of the nucleus. We're in a Jewish context here, so we can find that relatable. The idea of the Jewish mother as the nucleus.
I have to say, I just love it that I'm in a room full of people who understand Jewish mother.
Yes.
My young marriage was to a man who could not believe what a Jewish mother might do. I was sort of horrified, and no fault of his own. He just didn't know.
No, it can be shocking for sure. If it's not your birth language, I think it's an interesting one to learn and to pick up on it. But Eleanor's life in the novel is one of heartbreak. And I wanted to, and not just in terms of her marriage, but, as you were speaking about the topics that you're writing about, whether it's transitioning or whether it's adjusting to the many things, the unexpected things that life can throw at you. There is a unique role played by a mother. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about both your own experience in reality, but also in the book, about the unique role of mother love, and whether, I was wondering when I read, whether you through Eleanor were contemplating the idea that that kind of love can never really be fully requited.
For sure. I mean, this whole question of good mother, what is a good mother? Who is a good enough mother? One trait that I surely share with Eleanor, and no doubt, mothers around the globe, was the fierce sense of obligation and responsibility and desire to protect my children from pain. The physical pain part was actually the easiest, to make sure that they don't run out into traffic. That's, that's not complicated. Much more complicated was to save them, and much more complicated and impossible to spare them emotional pain. And I suffered from this, this affliction, as does Eleanor. There's a scene in the novel that does come from my life. She's hosting a birthday party for her, I think her daughter's 7 at the time, her middle child, Ursula. And one of the presents that Ursula gets, as did my daughter Audrey when she was that age, was something called a crystal Barbie that had a very special shoe that was clear plastic. It was like, and of all the aspects of crystal Barbie, this was the one that was the most important. So being a mother who wants to spare her child pain and can see pain like a mile away to, offset it, she urges Ursula to set the doll away and set the shoes away. But when the party's over and the guests have gone home, to Ursula's despair, the shoe is gone. One shoe is gone. And Eleanor then tears the house apart looking for that shoe. Why? Because she cannot bear more than any pain. She could be dripping blood on the floor and she wouldn't notice, but it's her child's pain that so afflicts her. And of course, what I know now, thinking about that moment in my own life and in Eleanor's life, is that the pain for Ursula of seeing her mother lose it that way, in the book I call it Crazy Land, is far more egregious than the loss of a Barbie shoe. What I'm proud to say I don't do that stuff anymore. First of all, my children are 37, 39, and 43. It's not possible. They wouldn't let me, and I don't need to. I think the far more attainable goal is to raise children who will be sufficiently strong and grounded that they can deal with the pain when it comes, as it will, as it does to us all.
Right. You can't take on their pain as much as you may want to. And
you have 6 children. I mean, I can't even imagine, just 3 children's pain was overwhelming. It was not overwhelming. I could always deal, but was it hard.
It's a lot, but I think that one of the things that you do so beautifully in the book is and it's very, you mentioned the words close to the bone, and that's a perfect description, unsurprisingly, for what you managed to depict in the emotional lushness of the book. You're describing to me it was painful but very real depiction of Eleanor's evolving relationship as Allison became Al. And I'd like you to discuss what you did to make it so real and so beautifully loving, and how you played into that realization that I think that mothers have at some point or another, that, that I guess the nursery school adage, you get what you get. These are your children, no matter what you may have thought they would be or who you thought they would be, they are who they are.
They've got their idea.
God to love them.
Yes. You said something really wise earlier, Jordana, which was that, that it's about expectations and the futility of having too many of them, because our lives go in so many directions we would never have imagined. Would I think that at this age I would be sitting, by this volcano, with no, and so much more. If you publish a novel like this one in the year 2021, one of the things that happens is, and you may know this, somebody called a sensitivity reader goes over the manuscript to make sure that you're not offending anybody. I don't want to set out to offend people, but I think, sometimes literature has to shake people up a bit. But there was because one of the characters marries a Mexican-American woman. There was a Latinx sensitivity reader, and there was a transgender reader. And when the transgender reader came back with their report, they said they were very, very critical of how Eleanor initially responded to her then daughter's words that she was actually really was meant to be a man and was going to transition to become one. This, incidentally, in the novel, this takes place around the year 2000, very different times from now. And I was instructed that really this was a transphobic response. Mm-hmm. I did not change the book. One of the functions of fiction is not simply to set out characters who all behave in exactly the way that, we feel they should, and the politically correct way. And they are human, they are flawed, and they have their vulnerabilities. And certainly it shouldn't be hard to understand why a mother of a beloved daughter, hearing that she will no longer be the mother of a daughter, she will be the mother of a son, is not initially euphoric about this. But part of the journey of this character, and I repeat, this is not a book about that. It's actually, in terms of how many pages it occupies, it's not that many, but it's important to me as a metaphor, not only for this story, but all the stories, is that our journey is discovering that it's okay, and that letting go, surrendering, this turns out to be the good news in Eleanor's life, that a child who always felt very uncomfortable in her body is now liberated. And other things are not so joyful that she thought were going to be okay.
Right. And I don't really like giving spoilers in the context of these interviews, because I don't like to assume that everyone has finished the book. However,
going to after though, aren't they?
There is a tragic accident early on that is in no small part due to Cam's inattentiveness that literally changes everyone's lives. The book, the trajectory of every single person's life would have been different were it not for that moment. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on the roles of blame and forgiveness, both in marriage and in life.
The father, he's very different from Eleanor, Cam. He's a very charismatic, playful, joyful, unworried person. He does not suffer anybody's pain. He incidentally also doesn't earn a living, and Eleanor does. And so he's a good time guy. Everybody, loves him. He's the fun father. And he falls asleep on the job, actually, literally, and something terrible happens. As it could to any of us there, but for the grace of God. We can never, I've met people over the years, who turned their back and a child drowned in the bathtub. His is not this unspeakable crime. It's a very human failure with vast consequences that nobody could have imagined. The other, I won't call it a crime, but this is followed by another great failure, this one on the part of Eleanor. She cannot let it go. And although that story, the story of the accident, is thankfully, a complete invention, the experience of being a woman who held onto grievances in my younger years, and even my not as young years, is familiar. And I wanted to look at that. I couldn't have written this book when I was 45 or 55, probably. I think I had to have every one of the years that I have, although it's a story of a young family in the majority of its pages. I had to have all of these years under my belt. Maybe some will do better and get to that place sooner. But for me, I had to have reached this age in life to let go in the way that I now have. For myself, oddly enough, it was the experience, a completely unrelated experience, of having made, in my late 50s, a very good second marriage after many years alone, to a really wonderful partner who, a year after our marriage, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and a year and a half after that, at my side in our bed, died. That was 5 years ago. That experience, more than anything else that has ever happened in my life, I think changed me and made me recognize the futility of being angry, the preciousness of every single person who was alive in my world and who had brought me to where I was. I wrote a book about Jim and me, my second husband, and not so much his death as, the experience of making this marriage and discovering what a good marriage felt like. But that book in some ways informed this one, even though there's not a shred of that. There's a tiny little piece of it at the very end, having to do with Eleanor and Cam. But I'm, growing older carries a lot of losses with it. My knees aren't what they used to be. My skin is, I could go on, my hair, which I just touched up for this event yesterday at a Guatemalan beauty salon across the lake. But one of the gifts, and I'm going to appreciate it for all it's worth, is that kind of self-knowledge and acceptance, surrender.
And it's, surrender, it may be one of the most brave things that a person can do. A forfeiture of any illusion of control or, or capability to steer the ship. The ship goes in some crazy places. And I don't, for me to tell you that seems inherently ridiculous. I'm not going to talk too much about the relationship for whom you left Yale when you were 18, and you dropped out. You're back at Yale. I do want to get back to that and talk about that.
I so appreciate what you said, because, you know, it is, I mean, to me, it is the most anti-feminist place to come from, that I would still be defined as I am in the eyes of many people by, you know, the famous man that I was with when I was young.
Well, and when you consider that the length of time that you were in that, if you want to call it a relationship, compared to your second marriage, for example, compared to the length of time that you've been a writer, compared to the length of time that you've been a mother. I mean, what I want to talk about is that in this novel, this marriage, Cam and Eleanor's marriage and its dissolution, they resonate with reality because it's a partnership of love. And if you had to point to a tragic flaw, it was that underlying inequality. And you also allude in passing, there's a predator / exploiter in Eleanor's friend's brother. And I wanted you to talk more about your thoughts about power dynamics and love.
Well, who could not call herself a feminist in the world that we live in today? But so certainly I have always been one. And I believe it's possible to both be a feminist and want to have babies and know how to make a good pie and want to take care and want to set a good table and make one's house beautiful and grow a garden and acknowledge that different people have different responsibilities and we are not all exactly the same in everything we do. I was a single parent for most of the years that I was raising my children. I was raising a daughter and 2 sons, and it was so important that they be men who would respect and support women fundamentally, and I know they do. But at the same time, we were products of the culture that came before us. When I was, I went off to college in 1970. I was 17. Roe v. Wade had not been passed. The Equal Rights Amendment was, under debate, obviously was defeated. We didn't have Title IX. There were no sports teams for women, or almost none for Yale. It had just gone co-ed. And I was part of that generation that was, to some degree, told a lie that we could have everything. Mm-hmm. That we would have our, brilliant careers, and, the doors had suddenly broken open, not just at Yale, but in so many other places. But in fact, really, we were given some important things, or we won them, we earned them, but we also were, the old requirements were not laid aside. So we just had to do more. And that's part of what Eleanor is. She is supporting her family. She is the breadwinner. She is also the one who is taking care of the children in the most constant way. I think at one point, one of the fathers on her husband's softball team speaks of babysitting his children. What woman ever says she babysits her children? And is that man a monster? Of course not. He is a product of his culture. Mm-hmm. They are all products of their culture. As you, I guess, alluded to, I'm back at Yale now as a student. I'm actually taking this year off, but and I sort of take it a year at a time. It's my 3rd year back, and I watch with enormous interest, joy and sometimes frustration, how much the younger generation of students now has changed. They're sometimes overcorrecting, in my view. They're very, fierce and earnest and unyielding about, heaven forbid I tell you your hair looks good today. No, not allowed. But I wanted to tell the story of the women of my generation who really had to do so much, and so much more in general.
What do you say to the people who take issue with Eleanor leaving the house and say that where do you begin? Because that, I have to say, out of everyone I spoke to casually who had read the book, they said, and they pointed their fingers in my face, and they said, you asked her why Eleanor had to leave the house. So I'm asking.
And again, we don't want to give spoilers, but it isn't really one, and it won't spoil the book for you to say that the family has a beloved farm that was hers before she married Cam. And when the marriage ends, she is the one who leaves it. And she ultimately, essentially gives it to him. I know a little bit about this. I know a little bit about such an experience. But I'll first say to the people who were so fierce, I wrote a book that got you feeling strongly, and that's what I want. I don't just want to show you characters who all behave perfectly, do make all the wisest choices. What would happen to the world of fiction if that were the case, if characters didn't sometimes make poor choices? But I will also say, I believe she had to leave that farm. She's a romantic, first of all. The farm for her was the locus of the heart of her family. And when her family was broken apart, and we could talk more about what divorce means in terms of, the constitution of a family, because I no longer feel that a family just ends when there's a divorce, that it's a broken home. But when her family, as she knew it, ceased to exist, she could no longer bear to live there. I understand that. She was married in that place. She fell in love in that place. She gave birth to her babies in that place. She has to leave that place, and she is not thinking about real estate values at that moment. She is thinking about her heart. And incidentally, it makes for a more interesting book. I never do sit down in a sort of calculated way and say, what's going to be a good storyline here? But Trouble is, look at Anna Karenina. It's a book about trouble. It's not a book about happy people who always are so wise. I'm not comparing myself with, or my book with Anna Karenina, but pretty good standard to hold to.
But I also wanted to ask you, because of the parallels between the novel and your own life, and I'm thinking mainly now in terms of the setting. It's just because the book takes place on the farm in New Hampshire, which has been your own personal context when you're not with this gorgeous Guatemalan.
It used to. I don't live in such a place now.
But. Right. And so I wanted to talk to you about, now you do this work relating to memoir. You've written your own memoir, but you've also written fiction. And so firstly, how do you make the choice to go into these issues and these deep emotional waters in the context of fiction rather than memoir? And to what extent does each one inform the other in your practice?
Such an important question you asked, Jordana. I'll go back to my life as I never call myself a teacher, a sort of a supporter of women's writing. Sometimes a woman will come to my workshop. Often they're not like professional writers. They just have a story that they must tell. And they recognize that this would be a good place to have that happen. And they will say that they can't possibly write a memoir because it would hurt too many people's feelings. Well, you can imagine, I have many things to say about that. Because, women do this all their lives, protect everybody but themselves. And I did it for a full 25 years, had a story that I felt I could not tell because I had to protect an important man. So then they say, I'm going to write a novel instead. I'm going to just, change the names and make it be a little different and make a novel. That's not what fiction is. Sadly, I tell them that I can't withdraw permission. I'm not a permission giver, but that's not going to go well. I write a memoir when I want to stick to the absolute truth of the story and when I know there's a power to doing so. Did I say a novel? I wrote a memoir when I'm doing that. when I'm writing a novel, of course, my life is still all over it. I'm not suggesting you do this, but if you sat down and read all my books, you would know a lot about me and my obsessions. You'd even know it when you read, To Die For, the Nicole Kidman character, the Matt Dillon character, the Joaquin Phoenix character. I'm all of them. I'm in Labor Day as the boy and the father and the mother and the escaped convict. The pie that he teaches the boy. That's how I make a pie. I'm all over my work, but the joy of fiction for me is that I get to take my real experience and reconfigure it, reimagine it, and control it in the way that I couldn't control my life and decide what's going to happen that might be very different from what really did happen. So it doesn't matter that, yes, the farm looks a lot like the farm I used to live in. And yes, the husband in the book is a woodworker and I was married to an artist. And yes, the woman writes a syndicated comic strip and I wrote a syndicated newspaper column about my children. This does not make it thinly veiled memoir. It's a work of fiction that allowed me to connect to the engine, the very intense, hard-driving engine of my obsessions and the things that I've learned in life, and reshape them. And I don't have a favorite fiction or memoir. I go back and forth. I love them both.
Yeah, no, that's
but to any woman who is listening to this right now and has a story that she longs to tell and that is maybe eating her up in some way, or man, it's not just women, but it's often women. I want to say, and feels that she cannot do it because, it would hurt her mother, it would hurt her husband, it would hurt her children. However real that those issues and concerns may be, incidentally, she's already sort of way down the road if she thinks that they necessarily will see it. It's valuable simply to create it, but you get to do that. You have lived your life. You have paid a big price for all the things you lived through, for the mother you had, the husband you had, the hardships you had, the disappointments, the physical problems. We have so few complete freedoms in our lives. This I say, do not ever deny yourself this one.
Beautiful answer. Thank you. And when you work with people and help them write their own stories, so you're just talking you and me, forget everybody in the chat. Do you believe that every single person is capable of doing that? Or do you think that are some more capable than others?
Well, of course, there's such a thing as talent. But I'm going to give you a really honest answer. People sometimes ask me why, although I've written 10 novels that I'm quite proud of, why I don't teach fiction. And maybe someday I will. I teach memoirs specifically because whatever else you may or may not be able to write, this is the story you own. And it's not about how much talent you have, how many writing workshops you've been to, if your grammar or spelling is perfect. I'm not one, incidentally, to just say, oh, go vomit it all out on the page. I'm like my mother that way. I'm tough. But I do know, and I've learned, it's been confirmed, that you give me a week of your life and you will emerge with, I'm not saying you're going to, end up sitting with Oprah discussing your best-selling memoir, but you will discover the story, and it's not just this happened to me. So yeah, I have never encountered a woman who didn't have a story, or a man, never. And I never get tired of hearing them and helping them give them shape, which is what my mother taught me how to do.
Do you think people are more capable of writing their own stories well, or baking a really good pie?
Well, I teach both, as I guess.
I know.
And I teach the pie because it's kind of a metaphor. I'll very quickly say that, although my mother was this, brilliant woman who could, quote any sonnet from Shakespeare or Chaucer or Mildred, so much more. My mother was really an extraordinary woman. want to read about my mother, go to my sister's Facebook page from yesterday. She wrote something really wonderful, but my sister's a great writer too. And I'm saying, I mean, we are a mother's product. Anyway, my sister is Rona Maynard, and she knows a thing or two about how to turn a phrase. Gosh, did I lose my train of thought? What was I saying? You asked me.
I'm asking about pie.
Oh, pie, yes. Okay, so this is of all my mother's skills, the one that I was probably the least conflicted about was her pie. She made a fabulous pie. And she never sat down and taught me pie because I never thought I'd have to learn. She was going to live forever. She was one of those kind of women. And then when she was 67 years old, the age I am now, she was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor, glioblastoma. And I left my home, my husband, my children to be with her for what was the last summer of her life. And because she was a woman, like so many Jewish women of her world, who believed in, the importance of a good meal and good food, and she was a fabulous host, part of what we did that last summer of her life was we had dinner parties so she could say goodbye to all her friends. She couldn't really cook anymore. So every single night I made a pie. And I discovered I did know how to make her pie. And her friends would say to me, of course, they said, we're going to miss your mother. And then they said, we're going to miss her pie, which I understood. And they said, would you give us the recipe? Well, we're speaking about crust here, of course, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
The secret to good pie is not some magic recipe. The recipe is always just about the same. It's how you handle the dough, and you have to see it. I'd seen it for 35 years. I was 35 at this point. So I began to teach pie to my mother's friends. And after my mother died, which was also the fall that my marriage ended, I began making more and more and more pie. It was a very comforting act, a meditative act. And over the 32 years since her death, I have taught well over 1,000 people, men and women, how to make a pie. But really, it's not just about pie. It's a metaphor about trusting yourself, not being so tied up with the recipe, taking this big, bold leap. You have to sort of consider how much water on that particular day. You have to feel it in your gut. And you end up with something very tangible that will make your house smell really wonderful. It's part of my mother's legacy, those 1,000, maybe getting on to 2,000 women and men who've learned to make pie.
If I don't go to the questions that people have asked, I think that there will be a mutiny. So initially, it's not a question. Paulette says, "Dear Ms. Maynard," I love
talking with you, incidentally, but I also want to hear.
But we have to, read the room. So Paulette says that she wants to tell you that she read a first article of yours when she was maybe 13 years old in 17 magazine. It was incredible. She has just authored her own book now at the age of 68 after her husband died. And she says, you have been a profound influence in my life.
Oh, thank you, Paulette. Well, you may not know it, but you've been a profound influence in mine. When I look at my life, it's gifts and and the parts that were arduous. It is readers that have sustained me. I lost both my parents very young. My marriage ended. Many things were complicated, but readers kept me going. Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to combine. I'm going to combine two process-oriented questions. Yeah. Amy asks if you knew how you would end the book when you started writing, and Larissa asks, how important do you find the planning process before you write your books? Do you spend a lot of time outlining and planning before you put pen to paper?
Never. And this is me. I mean, I will say, there are writers who would say exactly the opposite. I've heard John Irving say he knows the last sentence before he begins. Part of the excitement for me of writing a novel is the discovery. I'm writing the novel I want to read. And what gets me up every morning at about 5 to race to my laptop is I can't wait to see what these characters are going to do next, I know what my themes are. I know who my characters are. I know the kinds of things they would do. I didn't actually know that Al was going to transition to another gender, but I knew that Al was very uncomfortable in her body. And all of a sudden I realized what was going to happen. I didn't know there was going to be this accident, but I knew the kind of way that cam operated. And I knew that there was a pond on that farm. Nobody dies, and no child dies in this book, incidentally. I don't know that any child ever would die in a book of mine. Anyway, no, I don't know the ending. 20 pages away from the end of this book, I was kind of like worried, like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Where are they going to, I wanted, like, I love these people. I don't want to leave them in total despair, but I can't give you happily ever after, because that's not how life goes. And my characters led me to the ending. It's really true. It's true. It's new one too. I can't wait to see what happens. I do know some things, and I will tell you, Eleanor is finally going to get, a happy relationship. She will get that. That gives a win. She deserves it.
She does. She does. Laura Beth asks, Eleanor seemed to be so in tune with her children, knowing exactly what they wanted for Christmas without them even asking, etc. Yet when the divorce happened, she didn't seem to understand what her kids would need from her husband, etc. What created her disconnect? Because she really stabbed herself in the foot.
I forgive her. I mean, I've been such a mother. I adore my children. I think about them, no longer all the time, but a lot. And I've missed big things. She missed, when she missed her child's true sexuality. She missed, we look through the lens of love and through the lens of longing and with the, background of our own history. I forgive her. As I have had to forgive my mother. My mother endorsed, this is a hard sentence to say, when a very famous 53-year-old writer, and I will name him, J.D. Salinger, suggested I come to his house and basically move in. She sewed me the dress to wear to meet him. How do I forgive my mother? Because she had her own story, her own background, her own great losses, and she carried those to me. And I do forgive her. I do forgive her.
And Deborah asks, she says, first of all, she loved the book, but she says Eleanor was so kind to Cam, considering all the ways he mistreated her. I found it hard to understand how she could be so magnanimous.
Well, she hurt him too. If you had talked to me in 1990 about my divorce, it would have been all about all the terrible things that my ex-husband did. I've spoken often about the gifts of teaching. When I listen to a woman in the writing circle here in Guatemala, where, I host my workshops, talking about her divorce, I can see things in her story that I couldn't see in my own. It usually involves two people. So she had her crimes too. There was an anniversary in the book where he replasters their bedroom wall very beautifully. And she is hurt and angry that he didn't give her, a more romantic gift. That was a romantic gift. She missed it.
When we talk about honesty, Jennifer asked, how would talking about your father's alcoholism have changed things in your home? Would it have impacted your writing trajectory?
Totally. So I have said before, but I'll say it again. If you grow up in an alcoholic family, or substitute whatever big secret there is, whatever elephant sat in your living room, maybe you were lucky enough not to have one. But if you grew up in an alcoholic family, there are two extraordinarily difficult things. And only one is that your parent gets drunk, in my case, every single night, late in the night. The other one is that everybody pretends it doesn't happen. In my case, growing up in the 50s and 60s, in a small town in New Hampshire, where every morning we acted as if nothing had happened, I truly believed I was the only person on the face of the earth whose father did something like this, and that I must not let anybody know. And so I couldn't be real. And had I been able to be real, the suffering of the other would have been so much less, which is at the bottom of my own writing life. I put out these things that people call, shameless oversharing, because I don't want some woman out there, and no doubt there's somebody, listening right now, to feel she's alone. I'm willing to bet she is not. There's another aspect of this novel that I write about that at one point, and again, I'm not giving anything away, but one of Eleanor's beloved 3 children cuts her out of her life and makes it impossible for her to know her grandchild, her only grandchild. I can hardly think of a greater sorrow than this. I know women to whom this has happened. I have sat with them. I have heard their story, and they carry, among other things, huge shame, because mothers feel whatever happened, it's always their fault. I wanted to talk about that situation. And incidentally, to a woman, the women to whom this has happened are not the ones who got drunk every night, who were shooting up heroin, who were going off, clubbing for days on end and leaving their children with, TV dinners. They were the not perfect, but, trying hard mothers. And it is their children. They're often rather entitled children who are left believing that, their mothers failed them. And I wanted to look at that story. I wanted to tell that story because I'd never seen it told. And I will go so far as to say I've had aspects of this story in my own life to deal with.
Susan asks, why did Eleanor have to leave the farm, and did she understand the implications? I told you, the farm.
Well, we just about never understand the implications of our choices. Did I on that, sunny July morning when I was 23 years old and, promising my undying love for the rest of my life to, a man that I barely knew really, who barely knew me. Did I understand the implications? No, of course not. But we operate with as much knowledge as we have at the time. Did I know what it meant to drop out of Yale, to give up my full scholarship in 1972 at the age of 18? Of course not. We never do. We never do. We can keep talking, but I'm just walking to my plug because I look at my charge going down. So now I have to go. I have to leave. I'll give you one more glimpse of this volcano, and then I'm going to walk into my kitchen so that I don't risk being cut off from you. Hold on. Yeah, here I am. I'm back.
Okay, and Amy says, I had no idea there was such a thing as a sensitivity reader. Is this a newer addition to the book editing process?
Yes. And, no doubt for some good reasons. I look at movies that were made in the years of my growing up, and I'm appalled by some of the things, the messages that were sent out, that every princess needs to find her prince and, take it from there. But so I won't say this is a bad idea. I just think we also need to, as with so much of this so-called cancel culture, I think that nuance and gradation at this point has been lost. I wrote a novel actually after Count the Ways, a novel that I really love, that I wrote during the pandemic when I finished the last revision of Count the Ways, that cannot be published right now in the United States because it involves a white woman going off to a Central American country. It's a work of fiction, but of course it's inspired by my time in Guatemala. Right now, it's unacceptable and appropriative and colonial for me, a white woman, to write about, even from the perspective of a middle-class white woman, to write about such a woman in a Central American culture. I have just learned this week that novel will be published in France, not in the United States. So yeah, we're living in strange times, and I will always be on the side of, the progressive thinking and the inclusive thinking. And I don't ever want to make any mistake about that. But my gosh, we have in our very careful protection of these important values, sometimes we have lost our way, in my opinion.
I'm not sure if this question is a hypothetical or a request. Lois asks, with so much in current literature and entertainment dealing with mean and nasty people, violence, etc., can you write a novel about nice people / happy relationships?
Well, I'll tell you the name of a writer that comes right away to mind. And as it happens, her entire backlist has just been republished. Laurie Colwin wrote a glorious novel called Happy All the Time. Yes, we can. And sometimes a woman will come to my workshop and she'll say, I have a terrible problem as a writer. I came from a happy family. And I'm always happy to, I have no big trauma. Yes, you still have a story. Yes, I mean, some things did happen to Laurie Colwin, but read her work if you haven't. Fabulous.
Thank you. Susan asks, Jewish mothers are supposed to be the matriarch of the family and strong. There's shaming within Jewish culture when a Jewish mother is a battered wife, which is considered weak. Is there anything in this book or in any of your books about a Jewish woman character who is physically battered?
No. And I'll tell you, Susan, it's odd. Although I consider myself Jewish, well, I am Jewish. I had a Jewish mother, and end of story. I wasn't raised in any Jewish, religion, but I'm Jewish. I have never identified a character as Jewish. As you ask this question, I have to think about why that is. Of all the characters I've created, in fiction, I have never had a character like my mother. She's like, maybe I'm not a good enough writer yet. I've done it in my memoir, and my sister did it in one. My mother wrote a memoir about herself. My sister wrote a memoir about her. I wrote a memoir that really my mother is a bigger character in At Home in the World than J.D. Salinger. But no, why is that? I think to some degree I was going to say every mother is a Jewish mother. Every mother is not. I'm sometimes amazed, but I'll hear about these mothers who evidently weren't just wild about their children, didn't just always think they were the smartest, best, most brilliant, most beautiful, So I don't know. I have no answer. I'm going to think about that one, and maybe I'll be brave enough to make a Jewish mother, although I would probably be called appropriative if I did, because I'm not sufficiently Jewish. I don't know. I hope not.
Larissa asked something that I also thought of, which is when I was reading Count the Ways, it played out for me so much like a movie in my mind. Would you ever consider making it into a film?
Well, of course, first of all, what kind of idiot is going to say no? You know what the life of a writer is like? Yeah, I'm lucky that 2 of my books have been adapted for film, To Die For and Labor Day. And, I got a couple of years of my kids' college tuitions out of those. And some good movies. In the case of To Die For, I think a brilliant movie. So yes, I think it's not an accident that it's happened twice, because when I sit down to write, I always think of myself as making a movie. I think that I'm like, in another lifetime, I would have been a filmmaker, but I'm making a very low budget movie that only required me and my laptop and my imagination and my history. I am not only the screenwriter, I am the director, I am the movie star, I am the character actors, I am the soundtrack, I am the lighting, I am the film editor, I am the costume person. I get to be all of that, and I am laying out the movie that I want. And when I say that I write thinking about a movie, I don't mean that I write thinking about selling the movie rights. I want a movie that will play in your head. I want you to be sitting wherever it is that you read, in your bed, on your couch, on your, at your desk. I want you to be having a little movie happening in your head. But yes, I will say this book has been optioned for probably a limited series, and who knows if it'll happen. Often things get optioned and they don't. At Home in the World is right now optioned, and I'm very much hoping it'll be a film. There's one character in that one that will be very challenging to cast appropriately. And it has to be a very compelling actor to play that one. But sure, I'd love to see this one made into film or television. I love film and television.
And you have a few compliments. Laura Beth says, even though I'm the age of Al and could identify with them culturally, you created a book where I also identified with Eleanor as a mother, which gave me conflicting emotions because their interests are often opposite. Thank you so much for tapping into the vein of raw truth. And Janet says, the domestic affairs column helped me raise my children in the 1980s, and those articles were the highlights of my weeks. So those are two nice, but
it was Janet who said that. I'm hoping to, I'm going to be recording some of those. I love to record my work. If you haven't listened to one of my audiobooks, that's my favorite thing to do, is to record my books. So I'll be recording a bunch of domestic affairs soon, I hope.
And Marilyn asks what authors you most enjoy reading.
Well, I just mentioned Laurie Colwin. She's very much on my mind at the moment. I'm reading a a writer that I'd never heard of before, Catherine Haney. I always like to give a nod to the ones that we don't know, whose names we don't know. There's a fabulous writer who has recently become a friend because I reached out to her. I thought her first novel, published at age 60, was so brilliant. Meredith Hall, novel called Beneficence, that just came out in paperback. I want to recommend that. And of course, the old standbys. I always go back to Raymond Carver. I always go back to Alice Munro. I always go back to Jane Austen. Odd nation, but there you have it.
Estelle wants to know which of your books she should start with.
Was that Flo? What was her name?
No, Estelle.
Estelle. Hi, Estelle. I don't have a favorite book any more than I have a favorite child, of course. At Home in the World is the book that made all the other books possible. I'd actually published a few things before it, but until you can tell your own story honestly, until you are no longer keeping secrets, it's very hard to move forward completely, freely, creatively. So At Home in the World was the big secret that I told and was almost universally condemned for telling back in 1998, pre-Me Too. And after that, the floodgates opened. So maybe At Home in the World. But of course, I want you to read this one.
Yes. And Marjorie, I'm being sensitive to time. I know that we're toward the end of our time together, but I also know that Joyce may have something to read to close us out.
I do. And I realized this is very, very short, so it's only going to take a couple of minutes, but I wanted to just give you a little bit of taste of this book. The book is back out there. So we go back to the volcano now. Hold on a second.
And as we wait for that, I will say thank you to both Joyce and Jordana, because this was a spectacular interview.
Oh, it was so much fun. Jordana, I've talked to you for a long time.
It was my pleasure. And one day, Joyce, I'll be on that porch in Guatemala. That's my new goal.
To anybody listening, it's more than the porch, believe me. We're currently building a yoga platform. To anybody listening who to decline this call, who's interested, you just go to my website, joycemaynard.com, and you go, okay, I'm going to read a tiny little bit of Count the Ways. Here was what Eleanor had learned over the years since she'd wept over a chickenpox scab on her daughter's scalp and the bald spot it left there, believing that qualified as a heartbreak. The worst things, the ones that actually got you, were almost never the ones you spent your time worrying about. Now, here they were, just the two of them again, her and Cam. They had swum naked in this waterfall once. They had conceived a baby here. Here was the place they'd launched their little boats. Here was where Eleanor first met the man who would become her lover, with a freshly caught trout in his cooler. Here was where Eleanor had witnessed the sight of her husband locked in an embrace with their babysitter. She turned her face to the rocks. Even now, in midsummer, the water crashed over them, but somewhere, a mile beyond this place, or 3 miles, or 5, beyond the old people sitting in their cars listening to the radio, beyond the men with their fishing poles conferring among themselves on whether the Red Sox had a chance in the playoffs, and the young couples kissing or smoking weed, and the mothers nursing babies, beyond the teenagers daring each other to jump off the rocks, and the ones, like Eleanor and Cam, just standing there, taking it all in. All those human beings figuring out how to live their lives the best they knew. Count the ways. The brook would keep on running, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but the water never stopped moving. It flowed all the way to the dam in town, and beyond that to the river, which flowed to the ocean, which reached as far as the horizon and even farther than that. Somewhere along this stretch of water, in among the rocks and weeds, so deep under you'd never see them, slept the Cork people. You'll find out who they were if you read the book. I could take care of you, Eleanor said to the man who used to be her husband. That might be a good idea.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. This has been such a pleasure. I wish I could, I really mean this, I wish I could have a cup of coffee with every single person listening. And my books are the closest I know to getting to do that. And particularly you, Jordana. I expect to know you in the future.
Likewise. The beginning of a beautiful friendship as a movie closed out.
And thank you, Marjorie, so much for hosting this.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.